The captain's hand slipped off the throttle before his body did. For 3 seconds, nobody in the cockpit understood what they were watching. Then his head dropped, and the first officer's voice cracked over the intercom, asking, begging, for any doctor, any nurse, any pilot on board Flight 482. Amanda Croft looked up from her tablet. Down the aisle, past 24 turned heads, a man in a jacket she had mocked 40 minutes earlier was already on his feet. Before this goes further, picture it. A stranger stands up when nobody else can. What would you do in his seat? Or in hers? 40 minutes earlier, Ryan Kessler stood in the boarding line at gate 31, with his daughter's hand in his, and a duffel bag that had seen better decades slung over one shoulder. Ava was 9, all elbows and questions, clutching a coloring book she'd already started on the drive to the airport. Ryan wore the same brown jacket he'd worn to a dozen winters, the collar soft from washing, a small tear at the cuff he kept meaning to fix. They shuffled forward with the rest of economy, while first class boarded ahead of them, unhurried, sipping water someone else had poured. Amanda Croft came down the jet bridge in the middle of that group, scrolling through an email on her phone, the kind of woman other passengers stepped aside for without being asked. She didn't mean to look at Ryan, but his duffel caught the strap of her carry-on as they both funneled toward the same narrow stretch of jet bridge, and she stopped, exhaled through her nose, the particular exhale of someone whose morning had already cost her patience she didn't plan to spend on strangers. Some of us checked a bag, she said, not quite under her breath, so the rest of us wouldn't have to climb over people's whole lives to get to our seats. Ryan didn't answer. He shifted the duffel higher onto his shoulder, said, "Sorry about that," in a voice that carried no apology in its tone, only the practiced calm of a man who had absorbed worse from people who mattered more. Ava looked up at him, cheeks coloring, and he set a hand lightly on the back of her head, steering her forward. Amanda moved past them into the wider cabin, toward the seats with the extra legroom, and the attendant who already knew her name. She didn't look back. Denise Ford watched the whole exchange from the galley, arms full of pillows, and said nothing. She'd been flying this route for 11 years, and had learned exactly when to intervene and when a look was worth more than a correction. She watched Ryan settle into seat 34C with his daughter at the window, watched him check Ava's seatbelt before his own, and something in the ease of his hands on the buckle made Denise pause half a second longer than the moment required. She couldn't have said why. "Dad, can you call the flight school on the way, so they know we made it?" Ava asked, once they were seated, pulling out her crayons. "I'll call once we land," Ryan said. "Got to confirm my hours for next week's lessons, or they'll bump me off the schedule again." "You always say that, and I'm always right," he smiled, tucked the coloring book flatter against her tray table, and didn't say anything else about it, the way he never said anything else about the parts of his life that didn't need saying. The cabin filled. Doors closed. Denise moved down the aisle a final time, counting heads out of habit, and passed row 34 without slowing, though her eyes caught briefly on the worn brown jacket folded over Ryan's knees. Then the engines pitched higher, the plane pulled back from the gate, and Denver's skyline tilted away beneath them as Flight 482 climbed into a clear morning. Somewhere over the Rockies, Ava tapped the shoulder of the woman in the aisle seat beside them, a stranger with kind eyes and a paperback she'd stopped reading. "My dad used to fly planes like this one," Ava said, proud, matter of fact, the way children announce things they've heard 100 times and never doubted. "Before my mom died, he doesn't anymore, but he still knows how." The woman smiled, said something polite, and went back to her book. She didn't think much of it, but 2 rows up, Denise had bent to hand a blanket to another passenger, and the words reached her sideways, the way overheard things do, landing somewhere she wasn't expecting them to land. She straightened slowly. Kessler. She turned the name over, and it caught on something in the back of her memory. A name from a crew roster years old, a name she hadn't thought about since it stopped appearing on the schedule. Captain R. Kessler. She'd flown 2 trips with him herself, early in her time with the airline, back when he still had the reputation among crews of being the kind of captain who talked to ground crew like they mattered, who remembered the names of gate agents, who once delayed a departure 11 minutes so a mother could get her sick toddler off the plane without an audience. He'd left the airline 3 years back. She remembered that much too, remembered the quiet way it had happened, no announcement, no goodbye tour, just his name gone from the roster the following month. There'd been talk briefly about why. Something about his wife. Nobody pressed for details because nobody ever did, and eventually the talk moved on to someone else's story. Denise glanced down the aisle toward 34C. The man in the brown jacket was helping his daughter with a stuck crayon. Patient, unhurried, nothing in his posture suggesting anything but a father on a Tuesday flight. She almost walked over. She almost said something. But 11 years in this job had taught her the particular danger of assuming, of turning a coincidence into a conversation that embarrassed everyone involved. So instead, she moved on, finished her round with the blankets, and told herself it didn't matter, that plenty of men shared a common enough name. It wasn't until she reached the front galley and turned to survey the cabin one more time that she saw it. Ryan had rolled his sleeve while helping Ava with her tray table, and the watch on his wrist caught the cabin light, plain and steel and unmistakable to anyone who'd spent any real time around flight decks. Government issue. The kind men wore because it never stopped keeping time, never impressed anyone at a dinner party, and never came off. Denise looked away first. She busied herself with the beverage cart, hands moving through the motions while her mind stayed 2 rows behind her, circling the same unanswered question, refusing to let it go. She remembered more than she'd let herself admit at first. A red-eye out of Denver years back, weather closing in over the mountains, and a young first officer white-knuckling the descent while Captain Kessler talked her through it without once raising his voice. He'd bought the whole crew coffee afterward at a gate that didn't even have a working machine, walking 2 terminals over just to make it happen. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines. It was the kind of thing that made people want to fly with someone again. She hadn't thought about that morning in years, and now she couldn't stop. She wondered briefly what had happened to a man like that, why he'd traded a captain's seat for a duffel bag with a torn cuff and a coach ticket in row 34. Whatever it wasn't her business to ask. Not here, not like this. She tucked the thought away with the rest of the blankets and kept moving. By the time the seatbelt sign clicked off over the intercom, Amanda had already summoned an attendant twice, once for water at the correct temperature, once because the child 2 rows back kept laughing too loudly at something on her father's phone. Denise handled both requests with the same even voice, and on the second added, unprompted, "They're a lovely family, ma'am. Won't be much longer till she settles." Amanda didn't look up from her tablet. "I'm not asking for a character reference. I'm asking for it to be quieter." Denise nodded once, professional, and moved on, though something in her jaw had tightened that hadn't been there a minute before. Amanda's tablet was open to a spreadsheet, rows of numbers under a header that read Flight Crew Scheduling Optimization 3rd Quarter Review. She was a member of the board, one of 11 names on Meridian Airlines' letterhead, and this particular file had crossed her desk twice already that month, approved both times, with a signature she barely remembered giving. Somewhere in the fine print was a line about reducing scheduled rest gaps to cut overtime costs. She had skimmed it. She had signed it. She had moved on to the next item on a very long agenda. 2 rows ahead, a junior attendant leaned toward Denise as they passed each other in the aisle, voice low. "You hear the new roster for next month?" They tightened the turnarounds again. "I'm doing 4 legs a day now, instead of 3. "I heard," Denise said, "and nothing else, because there wasn't anything else to say that wouldn't get repeated to the wrong person." It wasn't the first complaint she'd fielded that month. Crews had been grumbling for weeks about the tighter schedule, the shorter rest windows between legs, the way sick days had started drying up almost overnight, even though nobody seemed any healthier than usual. She'd raised it once, informally, with a scheduling coordinator who told her the changes came from the top and weren't up for debate at her level. She hadn't pushed further. There were 100 small unfairnesses in this job worth choosing not to fight, and she'd assumed, wrongly, that this was one of them. Back in 34C, Ava had fallen half asleep against her father's arm, the coloring book slack in her lap. Ryan reached over without looking, straightened the book so it wouldn't slide to the floor, and kept his eyes out the window, watching cloud cover thin over the plains. He'd flown this exact corridor more times than he could count, once from the other end of the plane entirely, though nothing in his face gave that away now. He was simply a father, watching his daughter sleep, thinking about a flight school payroll that needed balancing by Friday. The plane hit its first real patch of turbulence somewhere past the Nebraska border, A hard drop and shudder that sent a drink cart rattling and pulled a gasp from half the cabin. Amanda's hand shot to the armrest, knuckles white, tablet sliding from her lap before she caught it against her knee. 2 rows back, Ryan didn't move. He'd wrapped one arm loosely around Ava, who'd startled awake and pressed into his side, and he murmured something too quiet to carry, something that made her relax again within seconds. His other hand stayed flat and still on the armrest. No white knuckles, no shift in his breathing, a stillness that belonged to someone who had felt far worse air than this and stopped being afraid of it a long time ago. Amanda noticed. She didn't know why she noticed, only that in the half-second before the plane leveled out, her eyes had gone to the man in economy instead of to her own hands, and what she saw unsettled her more than the turbulence had. A question formed and dissolved before she could hold on to it, replaced almost immediately by the return of cabin service and the low hum of ordinary flight. Up in the cockpit, Captain Daniel Wren had been quiet for the better part of 10 minutes, longer than his first officer usually let pass without a comment about the weather or the traffic ahead. When Ethan Rhodes finally glanced over, he found the captain gripping the yoke a little too hard, a sheen of sweat along his hairline that hadn't been there at pushback. "You good?" Ethan asked. "Fine," Wren said. "Too fast. Just warm in here." He wasn't fine. A tightness had settled across his chest an hour into the flight. Dull at first, easy to blame on the coffee or the early wake-up, and he had done exactly what he'd done twice before in the last 2 months. When something similar crept in, he'd waited it out, jaw set, telling himself it would pass. Because reporting it meant grounding himself for review, and grounding himself meant losing points he couldn't afford to lose under the airline's new attendance policy. 3 call-outs in a rolling year and a pilot got flagged for review. Wren was already at 2. He'd told himself the same thing 2 months ago, on a layover in Phoenix, when a similar pressure had settled behind his sternum for the better part of an hour before easing on its own. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone, hadn't gone to a doctor, because a doctor's note meant a call-out, and a call-out meant a mark on a file that already had 2 against it. He had a mortgage and a daughter starting community college in the fall, and he'd made his peace with pushing through, the way pilots had always pushed through things nobody outside a cockpit ever had to understand. The tightness didn't pass this time. It spread, sharp now, radiating down his left arm in a way that made his vision swim at the edges. He reached for the radio, and found his hand wouldn't cooperate the way he needed it to. "Ethan," his voice broke on the word. Then his hand slid from the throttle, his head dropped forward, and the yoke shuddered under weight it was never meant to carry alone. Ethan grabbed the controls with both hands, heart slamming, shouting for the flight attendants over the intercom before he'd even finished processing what had happened. "I need help in the cockpit. Now, anyone with medical training. Anyone." Denise was already moving before the sentence finished, sprinting up the aisle with a speed that startled the passengers she passed. She found Wren slumped sideways, breathing but barely conscious, sweat soaking through his shirt. Behind her, a young woman in scrubs had risen from seat 19, calling herself over as a nursing student, but one look told Denise this was beyond what a first-year student could manage. They needed someone who understood aircraft, who understood what came next in a cockpit with one working pilot and a captain who could no longer speak. The intercom crackled again, Ethan's voice tight with a fear he was trying and failing to keep out of it. "Is there a pilot on board? Any pilot, please make yourself known to a flight attendant immediately." The cabin went still, in the particular way cabins go still when the machinery keeping them alive announces, without meaning to, that it is no longer entirely in control. Amanda's hand found the armrest again, gripping it the way she had during the turbulence. Except this time there was no leveling out to wait for. Ryan felt it too, that shift in the cabin's pressure that had nothing to do with altitude. He looked at Ava, who had gone rigid against him, eyes wide, and he kept his voice low, steady, the same voice he used when thunder woke her at home. "It's okay. They're taking care of it. You stay right here with me." She nodded, small, unconvinced, and gripped his sleeve tighter. Ryan's eyes moved toward the front of the cabin, toward the open cockpit door and the shape of Denise crouched beside the captain's seat. And something in him that had been dormant for 3 years began, quietly, to stir awake. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "Dad?" Ava's voice cracked on the single word. "I need to go help," Ryan said, crouching to her eye level, hands steady on her shoulders. I know how to fly this kind of plane, Ava. I flew planes exactly like it for a long time, before you were born, and after too. I'm going to help them land safely, and then I'm going to come right back to this seat. Can you hold on to that for me?" She looked at him for a long moment, the way children look at parents when they're deciding whether to believe a thing entirely, and then she nodded, jaw tight, fighting tears she was determined not to let fall. Ryan moved up the aisle quickly, past rows of passengers who stared without understanding, and reached Denise just outside the cockpit door. "I'm a pilot," he said, quiet enough that only she and Ethan could hear it. "Commercial. ATP rated. Current. I flew for this airline 7 years before I left." Denise's breath caught. Up close, there was no mistaking him now. "Kessler," she said. "Ryan Kessler. You remember me? I remember you delayed a flight 11 minutes for a sick kid." She was already turning toward the intercom. "Ethan, we've got a pilot. Former Meridian captain." Ethan didn't have the luxury of skepticism. "Get dispatch on the line. Verify his certificate number against FAA records. Right now, while I hold this thing steady." It took 90 seconds that felt considerably longer. Denise relayed Ryan's license number over the radio. Dispatch ran it against the Federal Registry, and confirmation came back clean. "Active airline transport pilot certificate, type-rated on this exact aircraft. No lapses, no violations." Ryan had kept his hours current for the flight school without ever once needing to say why it mattered so much to him. "You're cleared," Ethan said, and for the first time since the captain went down, something like relief broke through his voice. "Get in here." Denise and another attendant eased Ren from his seat and out into the forward galley, where the nursing student took over, monitoring his breathing while ground medical staff talked her through it over the radio. Ryan slid into the captain's seat, hands finding the yoke with a familiarity that hadn't dulled in 3 years, and for a moment, just a moment, he closed his eyes. Behind him, through the narrow gap of the cockpit door before it swung shut, Amanda watched the entire exchange from her seat, disbelief plain on her face. The man in the worn jacket, the one she'd all but sneered at over a duffel bag, walked into that cockpit like it belonged to him. The door closed. The cabin held its breath. No one spoke. Somewhere behind Amanda, a man whispered to his wife, asking what was happening, and she shushed him, eyes fixed on the closed cockpit door, as if watching it hard enough might tell her something. Amanda realized her hand was still gripping the armrest, and for the first time all morning, she didn't loosen it. Inside the cockpit, Ryan ran the instrument checks fast, muscle memory doing half the work his conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. "Talk to me," he said to Ethan. "What do we have?" "Altitude stable. Autopilot's holding. But I've never flown this route without a captain who wasn't me learning it in real time," Ethan said, hands white on his own controls. "We were 40 minutes from O'Hare. I don't know what the play is." "The play is we turn around," Ryan said. "Denver's 20 minutes back. We know the field. We've got full medical waiting if we call it in now. Chicago's not worth the risk with an unconscious captain and a first officer who's never flown solo landing on this airframe." Ethan didn't argue. Ryan reached for the radio, voice dropping into a register Ethan hadn't heard from him yet, calm in a way that seemed to steady the whole cockpit around it. "Denver Center, Meridian 482, declaring a medical emergency. Request immediate return to Denver. Captain incapacitated. First officer and relief pilot on board." The response came back fast. Vectors and priority handling. The machinery of an entire airport bending itself around one sentence. Ethan exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders for the first time since the captain went down. And in that small opening, something slipped out of him that he hadn't meant to say. He shouldn't have hidden it. "Ren, he told me last week his chest felt tight sometimes. Said it was nothing. Made me swear not to log it." Ryan's hands didn't leave the controls, but his eyes flicked briefly toward his first officer. "Why would he ask you to sit on something like that?" "Because of the points." Ethan's jaw tightened. "New attendance policy, 3 call-outs in a rolling year, and you're flagged for review. Could mean a downgrade, could mean losing your seniority slot." He was already at 2. He didn't want a third one on his file over what he figured was nothing. Just outside the cockpit door, still close enough to hear through the gap, Denise had gone very still. "That policy," she said, loud enough now that both men turned toward her voice. "I filed a complaint about that policy 4 months ago. I told operations that pilots were flying through symptoms because they were scared of the point system, and I was told it was outside my purview." "Who signed off on it?" Ryan asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the shape of the answer, even without the name attached to it yet. "Gregory Hutton," Denise said, "Vice President of Flight Operations. He built the whole scheduling optimization plan around it, tighter turnarounds, fewer rest gaps, and a point system to discourage callouts because callouts were costing the airline in overtime and substitute pay." She paused, and when she continued, her voice had an edge Ryan hadn't heard from her before. "It went to the board for approval this quarter." Passed. In her seat, close enough to have heard fragments of the exchange crackling faintly through the intercom the flight attendants hadn't fully muted, Amanda sat frozen, her tablet still open on her lap to the spreadsheet she'd signed off on twice, without reading past the summary page. Flight crew scheduling optimization. Her own signature sat somewhere in the digital trail behind that policy, one name among 11, easy to forget the weight of until it became the reason a man was unconscious on the floor of a galley 30,000 feet in the air. Ryan didn't have the luxury of sitting with any of it. He kept his hands on the yoke, eyes on the instruments, voice level as he ran through the descent checklist with Ethan, because whatever had caused this, whoever had signed what, none of it mattered if he didn't get this plane on the ground first. The descent into Denver came fast and rough, low clouds breaking apart to reveal the familiar grid of runways below, emergency vehicles already visible along the taxiway, lights turning without sirens. Ryan talked Ethan through each stage of the approach, voice never rising, hands correcting the yoke through a crosswind that tried twice to push them off the center line. "Gear down," Ryan said. "Gear down," Ethan echoed, and the confirmation clicked through the cockpit a beat later. In the cabin, the seatbelt sign had come back on 20 minutes earlier, and the flight attendants moved through a final safety check with practiced calm that didn't quite cover the strain in their faces. Ava sat rigid in 34C, both hands wrapped around the armrest, the stranger beside her the same woman she'd told about her father reaching over without a word to hold her free hand. "Avolether." Amanda sat 2 rows up in first class, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't looking at her phone, or her tablet, or anything that belonged to the version of her life she'd boarded this flight with. She was looking straight ahead, at the seat back in front of her, at nothing, silently working through the arithmetic of a decision she'd made without ever picturing a face attached to it. The plane hit turbulence on final approach, a hard shudder that pulled a collective gasp through the cabin, and for one long second, the aircraft dropped enough that oxygen masks nearly released on their own. Ryan's hands moved fast, correcting, steadying, his voice low and even over the intercom that Denise had patched through to the cabin without being asked. "Folks, we're on final approach into Denver. Should be on the ground in under 2 minutes. Stay seated, stay calm, we've got this." It was the first time most of the cabin had heard his voice, and something in its steadiness moved through the rows like a current, shoulders loosening, breath slowing, even Ava's grip on the stranger's hand easing by a fraction. The wheels touched down hard, bounced once, settled, and the reverse thrusters roared to life, pulling the aircraft down to taxi speed in a stretch of runway lined with flashing lights and waiting ambulances. A ragged cheer broke out somewhere in economy, quickly hushed, replaced by the sound of passengers exhaling all at once, some crying, some laughing, most simply sitting very still, absorbing the fact that they had made it. The moment the aircraft stopped, paramedics moved up the jet bridge stairs before the door had fully opened, working past startled passengers to reach the galley where Captain Wren lay, conscious now but pale, oxygen mask over his face, the nursing student still crouched beside him relaying vitals. They had him on a stretcher and moving within minutes. Ryan stepped out of the cockpit a moment later, and the applause that had been building since the wheels touched down broke over him in full, passengers rising in their seats, some reaching to shake his hand as he passed. He didn't linger for any of it. His eyes found row 34, found Ava standing on her seat with tears streaking her face, and he crossed the distance in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding on the way a man holds on when he's just remembered exactly what he almost lost. "Told you I'd come back," he said into her hair. "You always say that too," Ava managed, Half laugh, half sob, and for a moment nothing else in the cabin existed at all. By the time they'd deplaned onto the tarmac, a small crowd of Meridian personnel had gathered near the terminal doors, radios crackling, someone already filming on a phone that a ground supervisor quickly asked them to put away. Gregory Hutton arrived within the hour. Summoned the moment word reached corporate that a captain had gone down mid-flight, and he moved through the gathered crew with the practiced smoothness of a man who had spent a career turning bad headlines into manageable footnotes. A medical event, he said to the small cluster of reporters who'd already caught wind of it. Entirely unforeseeable. Our first officer and an off-duty pilot, who happened to be aboard, handled it with exceptional professionalism, and we're grateful the outcome was a safe one. Denise stood near the edge of the group, arms crossed, and when a reporter's microphone drifted close enough, she didn't wait to be asked. It wasn't unforeseeable, she said, loud enough to cut through Hutton's practiced calm. I filed a complaint 4 months ago about pilots flying through symptoms because they were afraid of losing points under the new attendance policy. That complaint is on record. Captain Wren told his first officer he'd had chest tightness for weeks and didn't report it because he was already at 2 callouts this year. Hutton's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. That's an internal matter, and not one for... It's not internal anymore, Denise said. It just happened on live television. Amanda had been standing a few feet back, arms wrapped around herself against the wind coming off the tarmac, and she stepped forward now, voice quiet but carrying. Gregory. Hutton turned, and whatever composure he'd been holding slipped a fraction at the sight of her. Amanda, I didn't realize you were on this flight. I signed the scheduling optimization plan, she said. Twice. You told the board it would improve on-time performance and reduce overtime costs. You didn't mention it would mean pilots hiding heart symptoms because they were afraid of a point system you built. The policy wasn't designed to. I don't care what it was designed to do. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. I care what it did. I watched a man collapse at the controls of a plane I was on, Gregory, and I need you to understand that I am not going to let this stay an internal matter. Hutton opened his mouth, found nothing useful to put in it, and closed it again. A short distance away, Ryan stood with Ava's hand in his, watching the exchange without stepping into it. No reason to insert himself into a fight that had never been his to have. He caught Amanda's eye once, across the tarmac, and neither of them said anything. There was nothing simple enough to say, but something passed between them anyway. Unspoken, the particular understanding of 2 people who had just come through the same fire from opposite ends of it. Denise walked over a moment later, resting a hand briefly on Ryan's shoulder. Thank you, she said. Really, you'd have found someone else, maybe. She glanced back at Amanda, still standing rigid in front of Hutton. Doesn't mean it wasn't you. Ava tugged at her father's sleeve, watching the ambulance doors close around Captain Wren with the wide, careful eyes of a child cataloging something she wasn't sure yet how to feel about. Is he going to be okay? They think so, Ryan said. They caught it fast because we turned around fast. That matters. Because you used to fly planes like this one. Because a lot of people did their jobs right, today. Me included, but not just me. He crouched down, met her eyes. Ready to go home? She nodded, and slipped her hand back into his, and they walked together toward the terminal doors, past reporters who didn't yet know his name and wouldn't hear it from him, past Hutton still fumbling for language that might survive the evening news, past Denise already on her phone, requesting a formal meeting with the safety board first thing in the morning. 11 days later, Meridian Airlines Board of Directors convened an emergency session in a downtown Denver conference room at a meeting called at Amanda's insistence, and scheduled with a speed the company rarely managed for anything short of a lawsuit. She stood at the head of the table, no notes in front of her, and laid out the sequence of events without softening a single part of it. The scheduling optimization plan, the attendance point policy buried inside it, the complaint Denise Ford had filed and been told fell outside her purview, and the captain who had hidden a cardiac symptom for weeks rather than risk a third mark against his record. I voted for this policy, Amanda said, meeting the eyes of every board member in turn. Twice, I read a summary page and I signed it. And 3 weeks later, a man nearly died because pilots on this airline are more afraid of a point system than they are of their own chest pain. That's not a scheduling problem. That's a policy that punishes honesty, and I want it gone. Gregory Hutton, seated near the far end of the table, tried twice to characterize the incident as an isolated failure of individual judgment rather than a systemic one. Both times, Amanda cut across him with the same unhurried precision, laying documentation on the table that Denise had provided, records of the ignored complaint, internal emails showing the policy had been flagged as a risk by 2 separate safety officers before its approval. The vote came 7-2. The attendance point policy was rescinded effective immediately, replaced with a mandate that no pilot or crew member could be penalized for reporting a health concern, however minor. Hutton was suspended pending a full review, his file forwarded to the Federal Aviation Administration's Safety Oversight Division for an independent investigation into how the policy had cleared internal review in the first place. Ryan attended the meeting as a technical witness, seated near the back of the room in a borrowed blazer that fit him better than the boardroom's chairs seemed to expect. When his turn came, he answered every question plainly, without embellishment, describing the cockpit, the descent, the decision to return to Denver, none of it dressed up as more dramatic than it had been. He didn't mention what it had cost him to walk back into that seat after 3 years away. Nobody asked, and he didn't offer. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, Amanda found him gathering his coat. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You didn't have to." Seemed important that someone in that room had actually flown the plane. She almost smiled. "I owe you an apology. For the jet bridge, you don't owe me anything." He shrugged the coat on. "You fixed the part that mattered." Neither of them mentioned his years as a captain, or her seat on the board, or anything about the 2 lives that had briefly, violently, intersected 30,000 feet above Nebraska. There would be time for all of that, or there wouldn't. For now, they shook hands, professional and brief, and went their separate ways down the same hallway. 3 weeks after that, the rain in Boulder let up just past noon, leaving the small regional airport smelling of wet asphalt and cut grass from the field beyond the runway fence. Ryan was under the wing of a single-engine trainer, wrench in hand, when a car he didn't recognize pulled into the gravel lot and parked beside his truck. Amanda stepped out in flats, sensible enough for uneven ground. No announcement, no assistant trailing behind her, just her, and a plain paper bag she was holding, like she wasn't entirely sure why she'd brought it. She hadn't called ahead. She'd told herself twice on the drive up that this was a mistake, and driven the rest of the way anyway. Ava spotted her first, came barreling out of the small hangar office with a grease rag still in one hand. "You're the lady from the plane." "I am," Amanda said, crouching slightly to Ava's height, something in her posture looser than it had been on any tarmac. "I heard you tell your seatmate a secret about your dad. Back on the flight. Turned out to be true. He tells everyone eventually." Ava grabbed her hand without asking permission, tugging her toward the hangar. "Come see the plane he's fixing. It's older than him." "It is not," Ryan called after them, wiping his hands on a rag as he straightened from under the wing, and for the first time since Denver, something in his chest loosened at the sight of her walking across his runway, unannounced, holding his daughter's hand like it was the easiest thing in the world. They ended up at the fence line a while later, Ava off chasing a stray dog that wandered the airfield most afternoons. The 2 of them left standing side by side, watching a single small plane taxi out toward the runway threshold. Neither of them brought up the board, or the tablet, or the jacket she'd once made a comment about in a jet bridge that felt like it belonged to another lifetime now. There didn't seem to be a need. Some things had already been said, 30,000 feet up, in the only language that had mattered at the time. "I don't know what I'm doing here," Amanda admitted. Eyes on the runway. "You drove 3 hours to find out," Ryan said. "Seems like a start." She laughed, quiet, surprised by it, and her hand came to rest on the top rail of the fence beside his. Neither of them moved it. "I read the FAA report this morning," she said after a while. "Ren's going to be fine. Full recovery. Cardiologist cleared him for a desk roll while he heals. He wants to write you a letter, apparently. Denise had to talk him out of trying to track down your address himself. Tell him he doesn't owe me anything either. Man was scared, that's all. I understand scared. You didn't look scared." "Up there, I was terrified," Ryan said, plainly. No drama in it, the whole time. Just didn't have room for it until we were on the ground. Amanda looked at him for a long moment, something in her expression settling into place the way weather settles after a front finally moves through. Ava's laughter carried across the field, chasing the dog in wide, useless circles, and neither of them moved to call her back. The little plane lifted off the runway, banked west toward the mountains, and climbed into a sky finally clear of rain. He had saved her flight from 30,000 feet up. Down here, on solid ground, all she had to do was let her hand be found.